although it's been with us at least in the medical settings for more than half a century, but still is a mystery how this machine, this technology can produce such exquisite images of inside the opaque objects such as the human body. At the heart of the potency of MRI is the makeup of the human body, and that's why I have this slide to show what we are made of. And on the upper chart, pie chart, you can see the percent of mass by different elements in the periodic table, and you can see that the blue color represents oxygen. So oxygen by mass is the largest constituent of biological tissues of the human body. And then the second one is carbon, which is in red color, and the third one by mass is hydrogen. But this is kind of misrepresentation because of the atomic mass of oxygen, the relative mass of oxygen to hydrogen, which is factor 16. And that's why if you draw this pie chart through atomic percent, the number of atoms, you can see the green color represents hydrogen, and hydrogen is by far in terms of numbers, the largest number of atoms in the human body. And besides oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon, basically all the other elements in the periodic table are found in trace elements. Another very important one is iron, and iron plays an important role in hemoglobin in the human blood, and also plays an important role in fMRI, and that's why I just kind of wanted to mention that. So here's another table that shows you the contribution by different molecules. Here, these are not atoms, but they are mostly molecules. Water constitutes 65% of the body mass, and remember that water has 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. Therefore, that's the reason for the abundance of hydrogen in the human body. And then all the other stuff, the inorganics and lipids and so on, they are much smaller, and in terms of the percent of the body mass. In terms of atoms, this number here is 62%, the atomic percent is in hydrogen. This is the reason why we can do MRI. We can actually detect such a relatively strong signal from hydrogen. Hydrogen is a very special element in the periodic table. Hydrogen is the only element that has no neutron, and that makes it very special. There are some tables. You've all seen different types of tables, periodic tables, depending on the application for which you're using the periodic table. Different numbers are listed for each element in the periodic table. One important factor for the elements in the periodic table is gyromagnetic ratio. And gyromagnetic ratio, as the name implies, indicates the rotational frequency of the nucleus of these elements as a result of exposure to a magnetic field of 1 Tesla. And hydrogen has the largest gyromagnetic ratio of about 42.6 megahertz per Tesla, which basically means that if you throw a hydrogen atom in a magnetic field of 8 Tesla, the protons, which are inherently, they have a spin quantum number, and they are spinning, and they have to quantum spin state, they will line up. They will line their magnetic field up with the magnetic field, and by doing that, they will precess around the axis of the magnetic field at that specific frequency, at that signature frequency of 42.6 megahertz per Tesla. And this is how protons look like. These are the atoms of hydrogen atoms in our body. As you're sitting wherever it is that you're listening to this talk, your protons of the hydrogen atoms are rotating in random direction, and the random direction gives the magnetic field a random distribution in space. By the way, the protons are rotating right now. Your protons are rotating because they are precessing. You have to make a distinction between rotation, orbiting, and precession. These are, technically speaking, 3 different types of motion. And precession of protons around the magnetic field is a characteristic that is really embedded in the quantum mechanics of the nucleus. So I was telling you that the protons are precessing because of the fact that you are immersed inside the magnetic field of the Earth. And if you take that number that it gave you earlier, 42.6 megahertz per Tesla, and convert it to a smaller unit of Gauss hertz per Gauss, then that number becomes about 4,260 hertz per Gauss, which basically means that the proton will precess at 4,260 hertz or 4 kilohertz upon exposure to a magnetic field of 1 Gauss. And since the magnetic field of the Earth is about half a Gauss, your protons of the hydrogen atoms in your body are rotating at about 2,000 hertz as we speak. But once they take you from where you are and put you inside a strong magnetic field, here B0 represents magnetic field, these protons will line up. Actually, lining up is not the right number, the right name, because some of them will be pointing in the direction of the magnetic field, some of them will be pointing in the opposite direction. And the population of what we call parallel and anti-parallel protons will be roughly equal. So, and I underline the word roughly, they're not exactly equal. There are more protons pointing in the direction of the magnetic field than in the opposite direction, because it takes energy to oppose the strong magnetic field. But the signature of the interaction of the protons of the hydrogen atom with the magnetic field is the parallel and anti-parallel position. There are only two positions available, two protons in the strong magnetic field, and there is an energy gap between the parallel position and anti-parallel position. The protons in the parallel position are at the lower energy, and the protons in the anti-parallel position are in the higher energy, and there is a gap between them. That this gap is the function of magnetic field. So if you plot that energy gap, you can see that in the absence of magnetic field, there is no distinction between the protons, and they're all indistinguishable. They're the energy levels that we generate. And as you turn up the magnetic field towards a very, very high field, you will increase the gap to higher and higher numbers. And there's a very small, simple equation that governs the behavior and the energy gap of the protons and antiprotons given by this Gaussian distribution function. And the important thing is that when you compare the protons in the parallel and anti-parallel, the excess protons, the difference in the population, or to which we refer as excess protons, are a very simple and linear function of magnetic field. So as you go to higher and higher fields, you get more of these excess protons, because the protons which are the magnetic dipoles are pointing in opposite direction. They basically cancel each other's magnetic field, and you're left with the excess protons. These excess protons act as the inherent magnetic or induced magnetic field of the substance which has been magnetized. So as a result of that, the magnets that operate at lower fields, 1.5 Tesla used to be the standard field strength of the clinical magnets. And at 1.5 Tesla, if you generate an image, a voxel of 2 by 2 by 5 cubic millimeter, which if you convert it to milliliter, it's about 200th of a milliliter, will have this many excess protons in it, something of the order of 10 to the power 15 protons per volume, per 0.02 millimeter volume. And if you set that as the basis for NMR signal intensity, then as you go to higher and higher fields, for instance, I remember that back in 1995 when I was in Ohio State, we actually set out to build the strongest MRI scanner. And at that time, we were doing all our theoretical calculations of feasibility of high field to 10 Tesla. We actually aimed to build a 10 Tesla human scanner, for which we estimated that voxels can actually be reduced because of the signal to noise consideration down to about 0.1 millimeter by 0.1 millimeter by 2 millimeter, or a voxel volume of about 20 nanometer. So, we made the feasibility calculation showing that it is possible to generate images from human brain at the resolution of 20 nanometer. And later on, we were proven right. Actually, we ourselves produced images with that kind of resolution. And with that kind of accounting really of the number of protons per voxel, you would be able to generate an excess protons of the order of 7 times higher than at 1.5 Tesla. And therefore, considering all the other factors, all the engineering factors, and all the physics factors that we could lump into to enhance the signal, we predicted that an MRI scanner operating at a field of 10 Tesla would be able to give us signal-to-noise and SNR advantage of anywhere from 5 to 25 times those of signal-to-noise of 1.5 Tesla scanners. Now here, I'd like to tell you a few historic notes of the push for higher and higher fields in MRI scanners, and the push has been there relentless since MRI really made its debut in clinical settings, and the push for higher and higher fields, in spite of all the engineering and scientific challenges, are because of what I showed you in the previous slide, because of the direct role of field strength on the signal-to-noise. And because of the fact that, in order to produce images at high resolution and high contrast, we need to make our voxels smaller, just as simple as that. So in 1985, the standard of business was this is where actually MRI came into the world of medicine, and for some reason, all the 3 major manufacturers, GE, Siemens, and Philips, they decided to make 1.5 Tesla the standard of operation for clinical scanners. And then there were a few 4 Tesla scanners at that time. I think Minnesota was one, University of Alabama was another one, and a couple of 4 Tesla scanners in Europe and Japan. But for a long time, 4 Tesla remained the standard of research scanner field strength, and the 1.5 Tesla the clinical standard. So in 1996, when we started the push for 8 Tesla, as you see on this graph, there were really no prospect for going beyond 4 Tesla primarily because of the community, MR community's concern for safety. I remember that once I was talking about our plan for moving the scanning field strength to human scanning field strength to 8 Tesla, and in the conference people were laughing at us, pointing to the safety concerns and the engineering challenges, challenges such as susceptibility effect and RF coil, and specific absorption rate and SAR, the amount of heat that you will deposit into the subject in order to create a unit deflection in the magnetic dipole moment of the proton. These concerns were the reason why nobody really considered going to much above 4 Tesla, which was the standard of research at the time. But and for that very reason, we did a lot of study on safety, and probably the most extensive work in our group at Ohio State between 1996 and 1998 was concentrated on safety, and I think that kind of opened the path and shed some of the concerns and phobia about MRI. And then the manufacturers decided to, while 4 Tesla was the standard of research, they decided to offer 3 Teslas for the standard of high field clinical scanners. And then when 8 Tesla feasibility was demonstrated by our group at Ohio State, which we published, I think, something like 10 papers in one issue of December 1999 issue of JCAT, I think we addressed this issue of safety and feasibility and engineering and RF coil and SAR and so on. And then at that time, the manufacturers decided to go 1 Tesla lower. It seems to me that manufacturers are always interested in staying 1 Tesla below the state of art of research. And now there are a lot of 7 Teslas around the world. I'm going to show you a map of the world and countries that have 7 Tesla MRI scanners. The challenges that I told you about were design and manufacturing of the MRI scanners operating at very high fields, safety, as I said, safety for both static magnetic field and RF power. One of the concern of susceptibility, increased susceptibility, which we know goes up directly proportional to the field strength. was a concern that all the air cavities in the brain or in the body, such as auditory canal and the sinuses, will pose a huge tissue loss. And that was indeed the case as we generated those images, but there have been many clever solutions that different groups have offered and implemented. The RF penetration was a major problem. We know that because of the conductivity of biological tissues, RF gets absorbed as it penetrates into the body. And the understanding was that as you go up to a field of 10 Tesla, 10 Tesla, protons will be rotating at about 420 megahertz. 420 megahertz is almost microwave. And microwave, we know that through your experience with your microwave, home microwave oven, it heats water up. Water absorbs microwave very effectively, and that was a big concern. Both the fact that absorption will result into attenuated RF, and that attenuation is at the cost of generating heat and heating of the subject. Another very important problem was dielectric resonances. This is the kind of effect that the biological tissues will act as a lens because of their high dielectric constant. The dielectric constant of the biological tissues, because we are mostly made of water, is very close to the dielectric constant of water, which is 80. That's a pretty high dielectric constant, which is also into the focusing of RF into the center of the brain, and results into the center brightness effect that is traditionally referred to as dielectric resonances. And then RF coil design was another issue. I'm not going to get into those topics in detail, but I'll tell you this much. This is a superconductivity curve, and these magnets, the main magnet, the static magnetic field, is generated by superconducting phenomenon. And superconducting materials known to date, this is a list of all the superconducting materials. And I draw your attention to this pink line, the niobium titanium. As you see, the horizontal axis represents the field strength, and the vertical axis represents the current density that can support that field strength that you are trying to establish by pushing currents, pushing electric current through the wire. So basically, if you take a piece of wire and wrap it around the circular path and send the current through it, you'll be able to generate magnetic field at the center of that loop. And by adding more and more currents, you'll be able to generate stronger and stronger magnetic field. Of course, you can only do so much because of the fact that resistance, as you increase the field, the electric current, and here you see you're looking at very high electric density, amps per millimeter square. As you push the electric current, you are generating more heat, and normal resistors, normal conducting wires like copper, basically fail to be useful and practical beyond roughly half a Tesla. And as a result, we have to basically have a paradigm shift of moving to superconducting material. And superconducting material of choice, because of its feasibility, commercial feasibility, mechanical engineering feasibility, malleability, and so on, is niobium titanium, which provides very good electric field strength, magnetic field up to about 9.4 Tesla. And you can see that basically beyond 5 Tesla, the current density precipitously drops. And as the current density drops, you have to wrap more and more wires around your cylinder, around your former, in order to generate strong magnetic field. But we have another solution, which is pumping. So niobium titanium, this is the performance of niobium titanium in liquid helium at 4.2 degree Kelvin at the boiling temperature of liquid helium. You could always pump on liquid helium and take it to the superfluid state at 1.8 degrees Kelvin, and niobium titanium, the curve suddenly shifts by a few Tesla, and pumped niobium tin magnets suddenly become feasible up to about 12, 13 Tesla. And that's what the handful of actually 2 or 3 ultra high field, the next generation of ultra high field magnets that are operating in different places are doing. I draw your attention to this 800-pound elephant in the room, the yttrium barium copper oxide, YCBO high temperature superconductors that have been discovered more than 20 years ago, and we are working on different aspects of their mechanical properties, and if they become feasible, we can see that how they plateau up to about 20, perhaps even higher Tesla. And someday when we can actually build a magnet from YBCOs, we might be able to generate a magnetic field of about 20 Tesla in a magnet the size of a laundry machine. That would be amount to a revolution in MR. And and besides YBCOs, there are people who are working on other elements such as niobium tin and bismuth-based elements that can also, you don't have to necessarily have a room temperature magnet. You could have a liquid nitrogen temperature. And liquid nitrogen YBCO is quite feasible and within reach. And hopefully we will soon make the shift to high temperature superconductors because of no less than factor than the lack of availability of liquid helium. Helium is a precious element and it is not available. The helium that we are extracting from Earth, once it's used up in all these MRI scanners and high energy physics research labs, once they're released into the air, they're unrecoverable. And that is really a big blow to scientific research generations of the future. And that's why it makes high temperature superconductors such a desirable and useful and environment friendly and commercially feasible technology for the future generation of MRI scanners. This is the picture of the Ohio State MRI, 8 Tesla MRI scanner. It was a whiteboard. We basically designed every aspect of this magnet, including the table that's sitting in front of the magnet and the gantry that all the electronic control of the table and patient management was incorporated in it. This project was a truly multi-departmental. We had something like 13 different departments of engineering and science at Ohio State involved in the magnet. And in 1998, when we produced the first high-resolution images of the brain, it really was the pride of the institution, shared by almost every department of science and engineering. And even the Department of Art was involved in the design of the color combination of the gantry and the table. This was the perspective when we set out to build the ultra high field scanner. We at the time, the number of magnets were distributed among different field strength. As you see, the dominant number of magnets were 1.5 to 2 Tesla, mostly 1.5 Tesla. There were very few, there were some less than 1 Tesla magnets, mostly special magnets such as organ-specific magnets, head-only magnets, extremity magnets, and upright magnets and open MRI scanners. So these were all together made the rest of the MRI scanners back in 1995. And the prediction at the time was that the MR installed base in 2002, you see that 42% are still low field, as we call them today. There are a number of and then the second highest population was these open magnets, permanent magnets, and electromagnets. Superconducting magnets were basically at the time all the 1.5 Tesla magnets, and a small number of bigger than 2 Tesla. That was roughly about 1% of the scans. But by the time 2020, at the time in diagnostic imaging, the prediction was that projection of the US installed base was that it would be something of the order of 49% of the magnets will be operating at a field of 2 to 6 Tesla, which actually today it qualifies, the 3 Tesla scanners qualify for this blue region. So they weren't too far from the reality of today. And the 1.5 Tesla scanners are now down to about 15% of all the scanners, and the 7 to 10 Tesla scanners are also increasing very rapidly, albeit in the research setting. This is the map of the high field MRI in the world today. You can see that the concentration of high-field MRI is mostly in the countries with economically advanced countries and wealthy countries, primarily United States, North America, Europe, and now China and Southeast Asia. There's 2 in Australia, 1 in Israel, and 1 in Brazil. I think altogether, if you add them up, you will have something like 7 Tesla MRI scanners, which are primarily used for research. Now, the question is, why do we have to go so far as paying millions of dollars for these MRI scanners? So what can they give us? Well, MRI by itself, not just also high-field MRI, it has really revolutionized diagnostic radiology. You can imagine that before MRI, we only had CT and X-ray to rely on. Although we have PET, positive emission tomography, and single photon emission tomography, but they were very variety of technological problems. Primarily the resolution in PET and SPECT was the problem, and PET and SPECT both are really functional MRI scanners. They are not structural MRI scanners, and the space, the vacuum for a diagnostic imaging tool with very good gray matter, white matter contrast with biological tissue contrast was really felt at the time, and MRI filled that void. So the soft tissue contrast in MRI is really second to none. It's unmatched by any other imaging modality. The fact that MRI with various modalities, including spectroscopy, can really replace biopsy and invasive procedures, and perhaps even someday diagnostic surgery, and has been used and will probably be even more used in guided therapy in the future. It can also, because of the fact that now we are really incorporating motion in MRI, it can also be used for physiological therapy, for physiological monitoring, and physiological monitoring of next level, not the same as the physiological monitoring systems that we have, which is really at the mercy of the chemistry of those instruments. As I said, non-invasive chemical composition mapping of the body because of the fact that every element in the periodic table does have an MR signature. You should basically be able to do MR spectroscopy with every element, at least those which have abundance in the human body. The most interesting one is carbon-13, and we can basically use carbon-13 spectroscopy to study metabolism and use Krebs cycle and gain really some fundamental cellular information about the specific region in the human body. And obviously the energetics detectable by phosphorus and the turnover of adenosine triphosphate and ATP is just a few examples of what MRI has done so far and can do as it becomes more and more empowered by the increase in the field strength. So in this table, you're looking at the gyromagnetic ratio of various elements. Specifically, remember that in 1985, the gyromagnetic ratio of the dominant magnets in clinical setting was 1.5 Tesla, and that makes the gyromagnetic ratio, the frequency, operational frequency of those scanners at 63 megahertz, 64 megahertz. In contrast, when we went to 8 Tesla, suddenly the operational frequency jumped to about 340 megahertz. And if you look at these other less abundant elements in the human body, carbon-13, which had a gyromagnetic ratio, actually operational frequency of 16 megahertz, suddenly at 8 Tesla, its operational frequency become 85. And oxygen-17, also another element that's very important, and you can do oxygen-17 fMRI rather than hydrogen fMRI, and oxygen-17 is a very powerful way of doing both spectroscopy and functional MRI, because you're really looking at an element which has very little background noise, unlike hydrogen. The same thing is true about sodium-23, which has an operational frequency of 90 megahertz at 8 Tesla, probably 80 megahertz at 7 Tesla. And most of the hardware for 78 megahertz was at 7 Tesla, and most of the hardware for 1.5 Tesla is hydrogen 1.5 Tesla would be useful for sodium 23 7 Tesla. And sodium 23 is a very special element because of the sodium potassium pumps and the role of sodium 23, which is a sensitive tool for diagnosis of the damages to the tissues, for instance, in stroke. Actually, back in the early 2000, the University of Chicago in Illinois developed and they bought and they purchased and installed 9.4 Tesla head-only magnet exclusively dedicated to sodium 23 imaging for study of stroke. So that's how important these other elements are. Although hydrogen does produce really exquisite images from the human brain, but these other elements are also important. Phosphorus 31 is very important in ATP and cardiac energetic, and cardiac phosphor spectroscopy is a very powerful tool in animal scanners, and it has been and it will be, and probably as we go to higher fields and the ultra high field scanners become equipped with more robust hardware, it can move into the clinical settings as well. The economics of ultra high field MRI is really, is actually maybe in the mind of people who have to pay these millions for MRI scans, especially ultra high field MRI scans. The market price for these ultra high field scans is about $1 million per Tesla. So a 7 Tesla will cost roughly anywhere from $5 million to $10 million, depending on how good of a negotiator you are. Some of the things they can do is remarkable. For instance, in the prostate biopsy, the study shows that an MRI scanner can reduce the number of invasive prostate biopsy by almost 30%. And prostate cancer is knowing that it's the most common form of male cancer, and around 400,000 new cases are detected every year in Europe. These numbers are astronomical, and if you can eliminate the biopsy, you would be able to save a tremendous amount of money for the healthcare system. Another application is fMRI measurement and detection of the level of consciousness in patients in the vegetating state. And we are really developing a more sensitive technique for calling a comatose patient vegetative or not. Now, there are a lot of people who are frantically working on the area of consciousness and the detection of consciousness through a technique called functional connectivity and resting state functional connectivity, which has come of age. And before the end of this talk, I would like to show you some of my own data on the functional connectivity and the detection of psychiatric disorders. EEG was the gold standard for the detection of consciousness in comatose patients, but now we have evidence to know that fMRI is a more potent and more sensitive technique for measuring the state of mental activity compared to EEG. In Alzheimer's disease, it has shown that fMRI at high field at 3 Tesla and higher can show the early stages of Alzheimer's, and before it gets to the irreversible damages to the fMRI to the patient, fMRI can play a very important role to empower the neurologist in dealing with the particular issue. The false positive calls of the breast biopsies annually exceeds $2 billion. And we can probably eliminate that by developing techniques for MR spectroscopy and other techniques to detect breast cancer and breast cancer at a much smaller level than the present biopsies can detect. And that by itself, just for one organ, the elimination of that biopsy will save the healthcare system by $2 billion. And you can imagine given the number of organs in the body, you can easily stretch that saving to about $100 billion once these technologies get developed. As far as the economy and economics of MRI is concerned, different countries are really cataloged by various institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the United Nations and UNESCO by different standards, by different yardsticks. This is the MRI yardstick for the classification of the countries, and you can see that in terms of the number of MRI scanners per million population, Japan has the highest in the world at 51. And then all the rich countries basically constitute the top of this table. United States with 39, although the number of scanners per million population for the United States is less than Japan, but in terms of absolute numbers, United States is the record holder. Roughly half of all the MRI scanners in the world are in the United States. And you can see the red line represents the countries of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. 33 countries, they fall there. And you can see that really the measure of economic development is really the middle of the table status. That's where the OECD countries fall. And basically, really, the number of MRIs are the representation of the economic well-being of every country. As I said, there are 30,000 MRI scanners installed in the developed countries. And that covers, although the countries with the labels of economically advanced and developed countries constitute only 15% of the world population, but they actually hold 60% of all the MRI scanners. And the rest of the world, which is about 5 billion people, they have only about 40% of all the MRI scans. The physics of MR is very important. A typical MRI scanner operating at 1.5 Tesla with a bore of 90 centimeter bore holds a stored energy, magnetic energy of about 5 megajoules. A 7 Tesla scanner, in comparison, holds a magnetic energy of about 70 to 80 megajoules. And by the time you go to 9.4 Tesla, you are really reaching to about 200 megajoule. And just to give you a sense for what this megajoule really, 200 megajoule really means, that 200 megajoule is the energy, the kinetic energy of a train, of a 200-ton train traveling at a speed of about 200 miles, 360 kilometers per hour. And if you can imagine all that kinetic energy being stored in the magnetic field in the bore of a 9.4 Tesla scanner. I believe that our 8 Tesla scanner back in 1995 had about 80 megajoule stored in it. The other projects take to push, as I told you, there are plans to push the field even higher. 11.7 Tesla scanners are actually built. There's one at NIH and one at the Neurospin in France that just came online. The one in Neurospin came online in, I believe, July of 2019. It operates at 11.75 Tesla. So remember that these magnets can either be characterized by the field strength of the magnet or by the precessional frequency or the Lamar frequency of proton. The precessional frequency of proton at 11.75 is 500 megahertz. So the protons are rotating at 500 million times per second. And that makes them more appealing for from the point of view of signal to noise. There are plans for a 14 Tesla scanner in the German Cancer Center in Heidelberg, and that will hold 660 megajoules of energy. And there is also a plan made by high temperature superconductor niobium-10 with the steel reinforcement, which is in the design for stages for a head-only system operating at the field of 20 Tesla. with 500 megahertz megajoule energy storage. So these are really the plans for the future. I told you about the total MR installation. I think I have to probably jump over a few of my slides if I want to stay within my allotted time. If I have to wrap it up in 15 minutes, I'm going to go to some of the samples of MRI images acquired at very high field. This is a T1 weighted image acquired by Siemens 7 Tesla. As I told you, this manufactures all three of them. They started working on these ultra high field scanners, and all three of them offer MRI scanners, wide bore MR operating at 7 Tesla. This is a perfusion image from a 7 Tesla scanner, and you can see that you can actually produce images that are exquisite in terms of T1 weighted contrast, gray matter, white matter contrast, and in terms of the signal to noise of perfusion imaging. Perfusion is one mechanism comparable to gold that is very powerful because it gives you a map of brain's ability to perfuse different regions, and the variation in the perfusion is a very sensitive function of brain function. Here is the comparison between 7 Tesla, 3 Tesla, and 1.5 Tesla. Activation map calculated on the motor task and fMRI at these 3 field strength for a single subject. And those factors of TE or time to echo is a pulse sequence parameter that's fine-tuned by operators of these magnets in order to optimize the operation, optimize the signal to noise and contrast. And in this case, they have optimized them for different field strengths. As you go higher in the field, the TE has to increase in order to avoid massive susceptibility that creeps in as a result of the high field strength. Here is the comparison between those 3 regions. The activated regions not only are more accurately following the cortical ridges in the brain, showing that actually only the cortical ridges are activated. You can see more activation regions in 7 Tesla compared to 3 and 1.5 Tesla. Not only that, you can see the difference in the signal to noise in the fMRI signal to noise, something we call fMRI contrast to noise actually. So you can see the 7 Tesla offers much higher activation compared to 3 Tesla and 1.5 Tesla, and that's really the power of ultra high field. These are T1 weighted and T2 weighted. Remember I told you about the dielectric resonances? On the panel A, in the T1 weighted image, you can see that the center is bright. That's the dielectric constant effect, the dielectric focusing effect of the RF that generates a stronger RF field here at the center compared to the peripheries, and therefore the protons at the center get a higher flip angle, and the flip angle generates a signal proportional to the flip angle. Basically, here the shadiness of this image is a function of the flip angle as you go from the cortical region to the thalamic regions of the brain. T2 weighted image is less dielectric constant sensitive because of the fact that you actually will refocus all the inhomogeneities because of the difference between the T2 weighted and the T1 weighted image. And but nevertheless, the fact still remains that the gray matter white matter contrast is exquisite in both of these images at 7 Tesla. The high resolution neuroimaging really, because of the high resolution that becomes more and more accessible by this high field strength, lends itself and offers itself to focus these magnets to the cerebral microvasculatures. We know that microvasculatures play an important role, and depiction of the microvasculatures will play a very important role in the future of diagnostic radiology. Recently, there has been a paper coming out of Italy by a group in Napoli, I think, that claims that even some of the autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis are vascular-based. and they have come up with this concept of chronic cerebrospinal vascular insufficiency, or CCVI, that puts the microvasculatures, the capillary beds that are in charge of really clearing all the perfused brain regions and returning the blood back into the lungs. The occlusion in the vascular in main veins in the neck has been promoted as one of the causes of multiple sclerosis. And if you watch the YouTube, you'll see some amazing results of people whose veins in the neck region have been cleared, and all their multiple sclerosis symptoms have disappeared for years, sometimes up to 10 years. Of course, this is a very controversial issue in the neurological community, and there are people who are trying to validate Zamboni's results. But what I'm trying to indicate here is that microvasculature imaging becomes even more important, even when it comes to the validation of ideas such as CCSVI. And we should, as I give you the list of resolution proportionality to the field strength, we should be able to go to microvasculatures down to about 10th of a micron, and that would be a great insight into the inner working of the brain and the implications of these structures. And in the future, as the images become more and more reliable and less distorted, I can imagine that the results become even more impressive. This is the work we did in this area in Ohio State. And the 8 Tesla scanner here is a brain tumor at perfusion at 1.5 Tesla. The contrast enhanced, the dynamic contrast enhanced MRI, basically that you inject the contrast agent and you look at the washout rate of the contrast agent. You basically, in this region, you can grade the tumors or different regions within the tumor by the rate of the washout, which is related to the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. And that is a very powerful way of actually in vivo non-invasive staging of brain tumor. Now, at the bottom, you can see MRI of the same patient. The 3 regions of the tumor, you can see that without even contrast injection, the fact that the susceptibility represents a classification, inherent classification between these 3 brain regions, which tells us that if you compare the 1.5 Tesla image on the right compared to the 8 Tesla image on the left, the microvasculature environmental details within the tumor, whose boundary is shown here with the brightness of the characteristic of these tumors, is really a telltale sign of how susceptibility can help us even in the areas that we couldn't imagine. I already talked to you about the prostate cancer and how we can help prostate cancer, so I'm going to go right through that. Intracranial pathology at 7 Tesla, it has been shown that the ALS, the disease that killed Stephen Hawking, can benefit greatly from the technology and the features that 7 Tesla can bring to the table. Cavernous malformations, cerebral amyloid angiopathy, and cortical infarcts and epilepsy can also benefit from the features of ultra high field. And you can see in some of the 7 Tesla, this is an image from NIH. I think Jeff Doon gave me this image. These are just simple gradient recall echo images of phase enhanced images. These phase enhanced images are basically the central brain region with 240 micron by 240 micron in plane resolution. Many of the anatomical details are visible in this image, including veins crossing the optic radiation and other columns of fornix and cross sections of the marithalamic regions and globus pallidus. So, having this kind of detailed images of these thalamic nuclei and actually looking at the internal structure is a great feature for ultra high field MRI that I'm sure will be further explored in the future. I'm going to rush to my results jumping over a bunch of 8 Tesla results that we acquired. Here's, I have to share this with you. This is an 8 Tesla rare image of patients with multiple sclerosis, and you can see that at the center of each region of plaque and demyelination, we can see a lot of blood vessels and blood implications on this demyelination patches. That kind of hints to the point of Zamboni's claim that at least a subsection of multiple sclerosis is vascular based, and we should really, as a community of science, we should look more into it. We detected cortical gray matter lesions in multiple sclerosis. This is a paper that showed that in the samples of brain tissues, they had actually observed gray matter, cortical gray matter demyelinations, and some of the difficulties in classifying classifying MS with MR. People believe that lies in the fact that the cortical gray matters are invisible in MRI. Therefore, there is no correlation between disability and the lesion load. And if we had a way of detecting them in vivo, it would really help neurologists in terms of management of this disease. Now here you can see in our samples, we have been able to image, and here you can see the cortical gray matter lesions. And this is a paper that was published with images of 1K by 1K resolution, 1000 by 1000 resolutions of about, I believe, 100 micron. These are more cortical gray matter lesions. And that brings me to the difference between brain structure and function, and how brain structure and function can really be exploited by MRI in general and ultra high field MRI in particular. We know that brain is the most important biological organ, and it receives and processes a lot of sensory information and motor information, and it's really, very simply put, the seat of our mind. And that's why there are groups who are working on using MRI for the study of consciousness, specifically Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff at Arizona State University. Penrose, who just won the Nobel Prize in Physics, are working on a theory of consciousness and the role of microtubules in the formation of human consciousness, which is a very fancy topic to make itself available to the MRI researchers. So, as I said, brain functions have been, this is nothing new. We have already cataloged the human brain in terms of its functions using fMRI, both task-based fMRI, predominantly task-based fMRI. And this is a result from University of Minnesota a few years back, that 7 Tesla, that shows that the cortical columns are at the heart of the smallest unit of functional activity of the human brain. These cortical columns are at the surface of the cortical regions of the brain, the cortex, and they usually have a diameter of about 1 millimeter and a length of a few millimeters. So if that is true, and the cortical columns are the ensemble of neurons involved in neuronal computation, therefore the detection, the high resolution detection, becomes that much important. And combining that, high resolutions of fMRI at 7 Tesla and higher, with this other technique of spontaneous bold activity, and a technique called resting state functional connectivity MRI, that, as you can see in this slide and the graphs here, there are 2 different brain regions in the temporal lobe that separate regions that show their activity really goes hand in hand. And there are regions, in other cases, the regions in 2 different regions really have no correlation whatsoever in terms of the fluctuation, temporal fluctuation. And therefore, the conclusion was made by Biswal in 1995, where the first resting state fMRI was presented, that the regions, the disparate regions, which are basically fluctuating together, are firing at the same rate, and this firing is indication of the fact that they are members of some networks. And these resting state networks, really network technology, came to life. And now neuroscientists are studying these spontaneous bold signals and its correlations between brain regions in order to learn about the intrinsic functional connectivity of the brain. And they have been able to identify a few networks. And these networks are really have been proven at different field strength by different groups in different regions for different purposes. And among all these networks that have anchors in different brain regions, the nodes are anchored in primary motor, some are in the visual, and sometimes in the extrastriatal visual and anterior cingulate cortex. And there is one network that's identified as default mode network. And the default mode network seem to be, because you can actually monitor the fluctuation, the temporal fluctuation of the signals during task and during rest, you would be able to see the interaction between the task networks and the default mode network, and see that the default mode network actually gets deactivated when the patient is focusing on a task in hand. And that really gave a very good indication to us that we could really establish, using resting state, we could establish functional connectivity map of the brain. And then through functional connectivity map of the brain and looking at the delay between the neuronal activity and the hemodynamic activity, which is the bread and butter of fMRI, then we could perhaps shed some light on the neurovascular coupling and the role of astrocytes in the neurovascular coupling. This is probably the last missing key in empowering fMRI and to take it to the next level to see whether astrocytes are playing a role. And we know that astrocytes play a very important role in translating the information from neuronal activity to hemodynamic activity. And unless we understand that, really entirely drawing neuronal conclusions from hemodynamic data is really not the best thing that we can do. And the way I'm using resting state functional connectivity is we are using in our group, we are using it to guide some neuromodulation, some modifications that we can induce in certain regions, in certain misbehaving nodes or abnormally active members of the network. And by modulating them, then we can even reach deeper lying nuclei, which is not accessible by techniques such as transcranial magnetic stimulation. And other people have shown that the TMS applied to the frontal eye field creates a correlation between the application of the TMS and the CBF. And you can actually look at the perfusion at the distal region to the site of stimulation, and that is also another indication of the existence of networks and the fact that different regions are members of the same network. Since then, TMS has really taken this up, and a group of people are working on guiding TMS both induce some activities, in other words, regularize and harmonize and synchronize different nodes of the network, and kind of bring this network back to its original optimal operation. And that has been shown that in spite of the fact that the field depth of the magnetic pulses are not very deep, they have been able to produce some really startling results as a result of the role of neuromodulation. Our group, this is a publication from our group that we showed that if we take a group of patients with depression and apply standard TMS, in other words, TMS that's not guided by functional connectivity, the number of responders out of a population of 32, there were 10 responders and 12 non-responders. And then if you take the non-responders and apply the functional connectivity guided TMS, then basically the entire population responds, judged by this battery of psychiatric tests designed for measuring the clinical implications and the clinical consequences of the depression. So you can see that suddenly the same technique, but guided by functional connectivity, which can allow you to guide the particular networks and the relationship between the networks, can make an existing technology of neuromodulation, which was the standard TMS, even more powerful. And this is, as you can see in the graphs on the right, we have been able to induce changes proportional to the change in the correlation between the DLPFC and the default mode network region of the brain. And these results are, although very preliminary and early, but other groups, at least there are 4 or 5 groups in the world. There's one in Boston, one in Toronto, and one in Stanford, who are following the same kind of functional connectivity guided TMS that and they've been able to produce some enhancement in the efficacy. And I'm sure that as we go further with our ability to focus and ability to assess the effect of these neuromodulation, various neuromodulation effects, we would be able to even have better understanding of the role of the networks in formation of the human mind. So, and that brings me to my last slide, the role of high-field MRI in neuroscience. I think that it has already, in a very short time, almost in a decade, it has proven to be irreplaceable and for its track record. And as you can see, the psychology departments in the country and around the world are gaining their own dedicated MRI because of what it can do for psychology and psychiatry and neuroscience in general, because it can really monitor real-time brain activity results, which has resulted in the discovery of networks and the interaction between the networks. And someday, probably, the way that the interaction between these networks are further studied, you will be able to even bring this technique of resting state functional connectivity to the study of human mind, what we call healthy human mind today. And in comparison with the normal brain networks localized in the abnormal brain regions, psychiatric and neurological disorders, we would be able to actually study the etiology of these diseases non-invasively. And of course, further progress in scanner technology and computational methods and the pulse sequences and safety of these fields are necessary. But that's the good news for all the biomedical engineers and physicists of the world. And the future seems to be very bright for high-field MRI and what it can bring to the table for medicine in general. And I think I'm going to stop here, and I would be glad to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kangarlu, for a wonderful talk. So we will open the floor to any questions, please. Now, please go ahead.
Good morning. Very nice talk. And one of the questions that I have is when you step away from the protons. And yes, the gyromagnetic ratios are important, but when you go to carbon 13, nitrogen 15, oxygen 17, unlike phosphorus 31 and the proton, those elements are 1% or less. They have 1% or less of natural abundance. So do you add contrast agents, and how do you deal with that? I mean, doesn't it have, don't these elements have to get metabolized before you do any imaging and analysis?
So you always have, for instance, if you want to do functional carbon-13 functional imaging, you have the choice of using carbon-13 enhanced glucose and inject that as a contrast agent. And once that glucose with basically all carbon-13 elements in its molecular structure are taken to the site of the brain activity, then you have a very high concentration of carbon-13 with a good signature of MR. So using hyperpolarized carbon-13, hyperpolarized other elements, helium, for instance, one of the problems you have with MRI is one of the deficiencies of MRI is that it doesn't produce good lung images because hydrogen, basically the cavity, the large cavity of the lung, introduces a very high susceptibility, and the absence of high concentration of the hydrogen containing elements in the lung doesn't really produce very good images from the lung. This way, people have been developing hyperpolarized helium so that patient inhales a balloon full of helium-3 with hyperpolarized helium, and they have been able to produce exquisite pictures of the human lung. And xenon-29 also is another element that can be inhaled and can produce very good functional activity measures of the alveoli and the pathologies of various lung diseases, and specifically in the CPD, people are almost investing more than $500,000 to build these local xenon 29 or helium-3 polarizations to be able to acquire lung images from their MRI scans. So there are plenty of options for doing non-hydrogen, the so-called low gamma nuclei of sodium 23 and phosphorus 31 and so on.
So, okay, thank you. So contrast agents, basically, that's what you're doing. Okay.
Jiayu?
Yeah. Okay. Very exciting, very interesting talk. I just have two questions. When you apply for the high energy MRI to the human body, is there any effect for the physiology? Because it's for a very short period of time, you align all the hydrogens in one orientation, right? That's one question. Second question is, you mentioned the high energy of the MRI or apply for the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. How early you can push that one? Because and we know the relapse multiple sclerosis is very hard to cure, to treat. If we can push that into early stage, that's much probably easier to treat the multiple sclerosis. Thanks.
Yes. So in your question regarding the motion, if I understood correctly, motion in MRI and how it can affect the accuracy and resolution of fMRI. So in pulse sequences, you have some factors, some parameters, some temporal parameters such as TR and TE that you can fine-tune that in order to suppress motion. There are all other ways of suppressing motion, such as navigation techniques. In other words, we look at the major sources of motion, such as respiratory and cardiac, and we can provide gating so that the images are acquired exactly at the same cycle, segment of the cycle of the respiratory and the cardiac cycle. And this way, basically, you take snapshot of the body, whether it's the abdomen or the brain, at the same spot as you took its image the time before, and this way you can eliminate the role of motion and physiological effects in MRI. For your question regarding multiple sclerosis, as you go to higher resolution, and you saw that those cortical gray matter lesions, they have been invisible so far, in 1.5 system MRI, which is the bread and butter of all the neurology and radiology departments. Now that, and probably there's a good reason for it, is because the neurons, the neuronal cells, or the axons very close to the neuronal cells are not very highly myelinated. Because of the partial myelination or lack of myelination, if there is any demyelination, any breakdown in the myelin structure close to the cell bodies, which is the cortical regions, then it will be very minor compared to the massive, for instance, demyelinations in the main parenchyma, white matter parenchyma. Therefore, they can stay invisible. Now, because of the sensitivity, because of the susceptibility of a very high field, now we can detect cortical gray matter lesions. Perhaps the detection of the cortical gray matter lesions will help us solve the mystery of why there is, first of all, why there is such a thing as relapsing remitting, why the patients start their condition with exacerbations and then they recover from it, and then they have these exacerbations, and these exacerbations, this relapsing remitting fashion of exacerbation comes and goes until eventually they elevate into the shift into what's called secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, while there is another entirely different type of multiple sclerosis called primary progressive. So all of these questions could probably be answered if we can get more insight, in vivo non-invasive insight, to the internal structure of lesions, both formation of lesions and location of lesions, and correlation between the lesion load and disability. These are all open questions that the newer capability that ultimately can bring to the table can help us address them.
Thank you so much. I think that's very exciting because the multiple sclerosis has a different treatments, and
yes.
So if we can correlate the pattern of the MRI imaging with a different treatment, that we really, really agree.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions? Okay, so maybe I can ask one last question, Alayar. So, and this is in relation to the contrast agent and brain tumor, and in particular for image-guided sort of resection. The washout time of the contrast agent and in relation to the actual surgical time that's needed, is that a constraint? And if so, what is the solution? Do you require multiple injections? How would that work?
It is a constraint. Obviously, the washout rate is a question. It is possible. So, you know, in MRI, we have different types of pulse sequences. We have sometimes when we're imaging a structure for very high resolution, exquisite T1, T2 weighted image, we can spend 5 minutes to acquire an image, a very high resolution image. Or sometimes we don't have the luxury, and we have to do fast imaging. And there are methods of acceleration of fMRI images. We can basically in my own research, we can acquire an image of the entire brain in less than 1 second. So EPI, echoplanar imaging, is a technique that allows us to acquire in sub-second or 1 second or 2 second images, depending on field strength, depending on your hardware, depending on the sophistication of, you know, whether you have multi-band sequence, whether you can excite different regions at the same time, or whether you can acquire multiple signals at the same time by the same detector, by the same RF coil, is so-called parallel imaging technique. So all of these different engineering techniques that has been brought to us, it allows us to really stand up to the plate and stand up to the challenges of these issues, the limitations that is imposed by the need for fast imaging, such as the washout rate. So we can deal with it by acceleration, and we can deal with it by really prolonging, by going to the contrast agents that have longer, you know, blood circulation life and half-life. Mm-hmm. So by a number of different techniques, we can actually get those contrast agents to do their job by enhancing the contrast at the site of pathology. And, you know, for instance, in the case of the most famous and the most widely used contrast agent for gadolinium, ETPA, it has really done remarkable job of, for instance, demarcating the boundaries of a brain tumor or different pathologies, or you know, demyelination patches, lesions of multiple sclerosis. So the answer is we have multiple weapons in our arsenal to deal with the washout rate and fine-tune our pulse sequences, our hardware, and the chemical agent, the chemical properties of the agents in order to give them a longer biological half-life.
Great, thank you very much. So again, I would like to thank Dr. Kangarlu for a wonderful talk, and so we will finish this seminar for today, and then the faculty will remain online for further discussions with Dr. Kangarlu. Thank you, everyone.